discusses ArcGIS named user configuration for MIMS Gateway. Configuring named users in the License Management add-in indicates to all devices in your MIMS implementation that this is the license model in use. Before configuring these settings, it is highly recommended that you review MIMS portal documentation on this topic, as there are a number of options that depend upon your ArcGIS enterprise architecture. Single sign-on is a less relevant concept for gateway processes. However, to achieve that result for MIMS field clients, specific architectures are required to be in place before any configuration takes place. So again, please consult the documentation to obtain those requirements. So first, let's look at configuring MIMS Gateway License Management. Open the MIMS Configuration tool and click the License Management add-in. If not already selected, go to the Configure Named Users page. This is now split into global settings that apply to your entire MIMS implementation and application settings that specify the named user for MIMS Gateway processes only. Make sure before you add your ArcGIS portal information that you know the architecture of your enterprise implementation. MIMS supports both portal tier and web tier authentication for named users. So what does this mean? Portal tier authentication allows named user credentials to be passed to ArcGIS portal for authentication. These named users can be part of a managed identity store such as Active Directory or part of a built-in manually maintained portal identity store. Think of portal tier as allowing portal to do the job of authentication. And this approach is more flexible in that it supports users that are not part of your company domain, such as contractors. However, it does require a higher degree of named user management. Web tier authentication passes the job of authentication to Active Directory. A user must have a domain login, which lowers the flexibility when it comes to user accounts, but it reduces named user management over time, and oftentimes this is the IT preference. So why is this important to know? Selecting the correct authentication mode is important because the method of communicating with ArcGIS Portal to request these credentials does actually differ per authentication type. However, we provide you with buttons to make it as easy as toggling on either portal tier or web tier. In this case, we have portal tier authentication enabled. Next, to configure these global settings, we would enter the host name. Architectures do vary, but this is the device that's used to communicate with your ArcGIS portal. In this case, we're using the default Esri architecture of having an IIS web adapter in place to manage all the requests to our portal. This could be another variation on load balancers in your organization. You'll note that I've used the fully qualified name of the device as per our SSL certificate, but this just may be the device name in your case. Instance is the name of our web adapter. Although ArcGIS is the Esri default, we've got more than one, and we've therefore named this appropriately to distinguish the traffic that the web adapter is managing. Lastly, the Use SSL toggle button should be toggled on by default, and this is also a default recommended Esri setting for your ArcGIS portal communication. And that completes the global settings. This information is going to be used by MIMS Gateway and MIMS Field clients to communicate with this configured ArcGIS portal. Next, let's move on to the MIMS Gateway application user. This user is for MIMS processes when your ArcGIS enterprise is federated. You can set named user credentials in this location and use them for all of your MIMS Gateway data management processes. And this really turns this into a set it and forget it configuration item. It provides you with one location to maintain going forward if your ArcGIS enterprise architecture supports it. Authentication types are basic and Windows, and basic is the default. Make sure that the user specified is on the domain if you had originally selected web tier authentication. The value in username is valid in one of two formats. In this case, I have zoe.selkirk@tct, but this would also be valid. As we're using portal authentication with a basic user, this can also be the built-in user, at which point a domain would not be necessary. In either case, this user must have file permissions across the devices in your implementation and ideally has a non-expiring password. If this is a domain user, MIMS incremental processes will come to a halt periodically according to your Active Directory security policy until you update the password in this add-in. If you select Windows, you are opting to pass through the MIMS controller user. This user is configured when installing MIMS Gateway and must have access as per the basic user. It's on the domain, has a non-expiring password, requisite file permissions, etc. And note that Windows is not an option if MIMS controller is running as local system. In all cases, the user specified must have the correct roles and content assigned in ArcGIS portal, and this is a given for any named user access to feature service data. Save your settings in the License Management add-in, and you can now move on to data management. If you are adding your first ArcGIS server REST endpoint, select the Add button. In this example, I have a list of ArcGIS servers that I've got access to. Ideally, you will list a single ArcGIS server only once to reduce the time that's required to inventory available feature services. Listing a server multiple times increases the inventory time frame by that multiplier. The important prerequisite for data management is to know whether your ArcGIS infrastructure is federated or not. Federated architectures require federated authentication mode, and non-federated architectures require server authentication mode. Now, two examples to review. First, to complement the set it and forget it named user that I've configured in the License Management add-in, let's review this ArcGIS server configured to use federated authentication. The federated authentication button is toggled on. The name I have given this ArcGIS server REST endpoint reflects its configuration for our purposes, but you can name this anything you'd like. Hostname is the name of the device used to communicate with ArcGIS server. Architectures do vary, however in this case again we use the default Esri architecture of having an IIS web adapter in place to manage all of these requests to our server. You'll note again that it is the fully qualified name of the device as per our SSL certificate. In your case, it may just be the device name. Instance is the name of our web adapter. In this case, it is using the default of ArcGIS since this is the web adapter for our ArcGIS server. Notice that there's no need to specify a user in here since we are using named user already configured for MIMS applications. The warning indicates that the ArcGIS server you've configured needs to be federated with the ArcGIS portal specified in License Management Global Settings. You may have more than one. The alternative is to use server authentication. This means that we won't be using the MIMS application named user to authenticate and inventory feature services, but we're going to override that with a different user. In this case, the server authentication button is toggled on. The name I've given this REST endpoint reflects its configuration, but again, this can be any name you choose. The name I've given this REST endpoint again just reflects what it needs to for our configuration purposes, but it can be anything you'd like. The host name is again the name of the device used to communicate with ArcGIS server. Instance is the name of our web adapter. In this case, this server also has a web adapter named ArcGIS. The username should incorporate the domain if this is a user that is in Active Directory. However, it doesn't need to if this is a built-in user. Add your password and then make sure that the Use SSL button is checked. This is a default setting. You can save your settings and exit, and MIMS Gateway is now fully configured with a named user license to enable critical data management processes.